Okay, so just to start off, Kat, I wanted to ask you, what is your experience with Lisbon like? When was the first time you visited? What did you think when you arrived?
So I was just there a few years ago, actually right before COVID. And so that means I basically haven't been back since because of COVID. But I went there and I was traveling there for my birthday because I had never been there before and I love to see new places on my birthday. So I went down there just to explore and to take things as they came. And I loved Lisbon. I really liked the fact that the city was so walkable and so easy to get across between the trams and the buses and everything. It's definitely not the most accessible city, I would say. It's a lot of hills and there's like a lot of
Mhm.
cobblestones, so you're walking up and down a lot. But the buses and the trams make it so that it's fairly enjoyable and walkable in sections, which I love. And as you said, Sophia, it's such a weird city to try and categorize because on the one hand, you want to say it's a river city. It's on the ocean, it's on a river. And, for me, I feel like that should really influence a lot of the feeling of the city. But you really don't feel that much of the water unless you're right next to the water. At least this was my experience. If you go to that neighborhood, that part of the city that's along the River Tagus, especially where the bridge is, it's the longest bridge at least the longest bridge in Europe. Sorry, it might have a even bigger title than that, but I know it's the longest bridge in Europe. And so when you're along that part of the city, you really feel this, and it's not just a river, which I find fascinating too. It's the Atlantic Ocean. So it's a very kind of this wild, rugged ocean feeling that I feel like most people probably wouldn't associate with, a cosmopolitan city in Europe, which is really interesting. The food is fantastic and the architecture is just great. So, I know this is what you were saying as well. It's so hard to categorize. Is it a river city? Is it a historical city? It goes back to medieval times, but is also very much a Renaissance city. It was rebuilt after the great earthquake in the 1800s. So then a lot of it is also more modern. It's such an enigma of a city, in my opinion.
That is the perfect word to describe it, I would say. And I find I've been a handful of times in my life. Every time I go there, I stumble across something new just by accident.
Yeah.
It sounds like kind of a cliche, but literally around every corner, there's a totally different scene, a totally different like hidden pocket that you never would really know about if you weren't just wandering around on foot and seeing what was out there.
Yeah, exactly.
It is just a really unique and indescribable place, in my
Yeah,
opinion.
very unique. I really, it's hard for me to compare it to any other city because I find it to be so unique.
Mhm. The first time I went was, I think, in 2011, and I was studying in Spain at the time, and since it's so close, I thought I'll just go over and see what Portugal has to offer. And so I arrived in Lisbon, and same sort of thoughts that you were just describing upon arrival. But one thing I noticed right off the bat is that so many more people spoke English in Portugal, and especially Lisbon,
Yeah.
compared to where I was living in Spain. And it's almost like a difference in attitude, where I think the Spanish, especially in the South, are so proud that they kind of resist learning English, whereas the Portuguese have this mentality like they used to be the end of the world, literally, when back in the days of exploration, that was the final frontier. And so I think they have this mentality of like they don't need to they need to what's the right word there? They need to be able to communicate with other people.
Exactly.
And
They're used to people coming to them. I mean, as you say, the mythology of Portugal, I mean, going back to ancient mythology, the pillars of Hercules were basically the Straits of Gibraltar, and that was, as you say, literally the end of the world to the ancient
Mhm.
world. There was nothing beyond, So people were used to, I guess, the Portuguese were used to people coming this way, and I think I had exactly the same reaction going there coming from France, where the French are admittedly, this is not me passing judgment on the French. This is most of the French people that I know who come out and say this very bluntly, is that the French are not good with languages. They don't like other languages. They don't like to learn them. They don't like to practice them. They don't like to even try and speak them. And whether it's an element of abashedness or pride or whatever, the French don't go out of their way to speak any other language. And I've felt similar feelings in Spain and Italy as well. And Portugal has none of that. It's very unique in Western Europe for being, it's almost like one of these Northern European countries where in the north of Europe, they're very used to, I live in Luxembourg and nobody else in the world speaks Luxembourgish. So I have to speak all these other languages. And the same goes for the Netherlands and Germany and Denmark and Copenhagen, all these other Northern European cities where there really is no lingua franca, and there's so many people coming and going all the time that they're used to having to speak all of these other languages. And I feel like that's how the Portuguese were back in the day, and they've held that mentality still.
Yes, definitely. You can feel that there's a sort of different mentality when you arrive there. And one thing that's also interesting that Kathleen pointed out yesterday is that there's been this relationship between the UK and Portugal, and it's the longest standing alliance in the world.
Yeah.
Which is so interesting to me. I didn't really know that much about it until I read her essay yesterday, and I was thinking, oh my gosh, I missed this whole history. But it goes back to, I think, the 13th century. It's a really, really long-standing friendship between these two countries. And that's also obviously influenced people's English-speaking ability in Portugal.
Yeah, definitely.
One great thing is that you don't really, especially in Lisbon, have to speak or make an effort to learn Portuguese if you don't want to. But of course, we always say, give it a go, learn a few words, learn how to say hello and goodbye and thank you and whatnot. One thing I wanted to ask you about, you've written some essays in the past about what it's like, what Lisbon and Paris have in common and what they don't have in common. And I thought that was a really interesting comparison. So I thought maybe we could talk about that a little bit and just sort of like the main differences that you see between these big cities. And I can also speak about London as well.
Yeah, well, it is so interesting because all three are defined by their rivers, really. Whether you know that much about the city or not, each of these cities has been defined by its river over its lifetime. And they all have such different feelings. Like, I'm not going to try and speak about London. I think Lisbon and Paris comparison is enough of a big comparison. But London is a whole nother animal altogether. But for Paris, I mean, Paris is an inland country, or a city rather. It's not coastal. It doesn't have the, say, effects of water that you would expect on living on a coastal city, but it has the feeling of a coastal city. You feel like the water is always there. It's always present. And the economy, whether it was going back centuries and the economy was based on fishing, or looking at today where the economy is based on the tourism of the river, there is, the river still does feel like the lifeblood of Paris. And it is literally the main artery that geographically, it's the biggest landmark in the city. It's the biggest way to tell where you are, what direction you're looking in, is to find where the river is. And that's totally different in Lisbon. Lisbon, the river doesn't run through the city in the same way that it does in Paris. You really have to go kind of to the edge of the city to feel the river. And like I said, it's not the river necessarily that you're feeling there. It's the Atlantic Ocean. It's the confluence between the river and the ocean. So it's a much more, the only word is this wild feeling, like I even think back and you feel like the salt in your hair kind of a thing. And so it's totally different feelings. In Paris, it's very staid. It's very predictable. The river does flood its banks occasionally, but the river stays in its banks. You know where the river is going to be, and it doesn't leave that area, and you don't really feel the presence of its nature. You don't feel like the nature aspect of the sea when you're around the river. It's a very civilized river. I'm trying to think of the word. It's tamed. It's a very tamed river, as opposed to in Portugal, when you do find the water, nothing feels tamed about it at all. So if here in Paris, you don't ever see dirt or sand meeting the water, but it's all concrete or cobblestones leading into the water. In Lisbon, you can just find a bit of, a street that kind of tapers off into the ocean. And there may be a plaza done in cobblestones, but it just leads into the ocean and it tapers out into sand. That I feel like is a little bit too too risque for the French. You know, they don't like to see that element of nature there. So that, I think, is my number one comparison, is that you don't feel the nature in Paris that you do in Lisbon, where you feel like the sea really is this untamed beast that the city is living next to. But it's also, you know, aside from just being riverfront cities, that it just makes for an interesting comparison. The mentality of the populations is totally different. I feel like the Portuguese culture is much more, and again, maybe you could actually equate it a little bit with this feeling of wild nature, where Portuguese have a, you know, this Latino culture, this Latina root in them that, you know, you put on music and you dance at a cafe, you stand up and dance on a plaza. Like I've literally just been sitting in a cafe and had Portuguese people stand up and start dancing around me, for not for any specific reason, you know, that was just what they wanted to do in that moment. And you would never, ever, ever see that in France. So there's a big difference in that kind of the spontaneity of the culture. And again, I think you could kind of make this very generalistic comparison between a Latin culture being more Portuguese and the French culture being a lot more reined in and a lot more, I don't know how to say it, like a lot more timid or something. So, for example, you see it in their attitudes on families as well. You know, the Portuguese love children, the Spanish love children, Italians love children. The French don't necessarily love children. Northern Europeans don't necessarily love that family aspect of life. So that's definitely something that I notice now, having a young daughter. But then in terms of so many other things, they are basically comparable in terms of being, you know, historical centers of the world, in terms of housing some of the greatest art in the world, some of the greatest architecture in the world, wonderful landscaped gardens that, you know, you don't see anywhere outside of Europe. These things are all comparable. So if you you know, if you're thinking about Europe and you're comparing all of these different cities and you're thinking, oh, well, Paris is, you know, has all the museums, so if you're interested in art and culture, then you should go to Paris. Lisbon has just as many. And that was part of why I said I decided to go there for my birthday a few years ago. And it was mostly just to go and explore and see the art and go to the museums. And they were fantastic. I mean, I can't recommend it highly enough, some of Lisbon's museums and cultural spaces and the parks and everything. One of the main differences, which we've already touched on, is that in Lisbon, you definitely don't need to know how to speak Portuguese. I would say you could definitely get by in English in Lisbon, but also if you spoke a bit of Spanish or a bit of French or a bit of Italian, even, you could probably get by. In France, that's not the case. You know, you really need to speak French or nothing if you're living here. And I mean, in Paris, it's a little bit different. If you're in the tourist areas, you can definitely get by in English. But living here, if you want to feel comfortable here, you would have to learn some French, which I don't necessarily think is the same in Lisbon.
I would say also just, and you may have touched on it a little bit, but the laid backness
Yes.
of Lisbon compared to, say, Paris or here in London. For a Western European capital, it's incredibly relaxed, and you don't have as much angst, which is
Yes.
the word I'd use to describe a lot of people here, you know, when they're walking to work, or you're passing someone in the tube or the metro station, and people are walking with haste, and you
Yeah.
better step out of their way or fall into line in the flow of traffic. In Lisbon, you're not going to have someone kind of give you a dirty look or snap at you if you're standing in the wrong
Which
place.
you definitely will hear. The French will not hesitate to yell at you, berate you in public if you're not doing the right thing, going down the escalator on the right side.
Yeah, same here. So that's really nice. And it's also laid back in terms of its cost of living. It was rated the second most affordable Western European capital in the world after Brussels.
Oh,
So
wow.
Lisbon, yeah, very interesting. Brussels is actually more expensive for monthly cost of living for an individual, but its property prices were slightly less than Lisbon. But Lisbon was first in terms of overall cost of living, which is really great. They estimate that 1,000 and 50 euros is enough for one person to live well in Lisbon, on average. So it's also, unlike many many capitals in this part of the world in Europe, it's pretty affordable, especially considering all that you just mentioned, like all the art, all the museums. It's got great healthcare as well. So it really stands out to me in that respect as well.
Yeah, and I love that you use the word angst, because that's actually the perfect comparison, because really we're drawing a parallel between all of these Western European capitals: London, Paris, Lisbon, pick a city in Germany. But what the big difference is between all these cities is that most of them are in the Northern Europe latitude, where you don't get that much sun. It's gray and rainy for most of the year, as opposed to Lisbon, where, of course, Lisbon doesn't get quite as much sunshine as the Algarve. But I still think it's like more than 250 days per year or something, if my memory serves. It's a lot. It's a huge portion of the year where you're seeing sunshine. And I personally think that goes so far to alleviating that angst that you're talking about, that here in Paris, you get into the gray sky, and you look down and you have your hood or your umbrella or whatever, and you're just, looking in front of you. But in Lisbon, it feels like the world is so much more open, and you're kind of looking outward and upward a lot more than in these northern countries.
Definitely. I mean, as soon as the sun comes out over here in London, the smiles come out as well.
Yeah.
The whole mood is different. And
Exactly.
I think they just get a whole lot more of that, which is great.